Hi, welcome back. We're going to talk today about the section of Sartre's Being and Nothingness called Concrete Relations with Others. I really love this section. I think it's really insightful, phenomenological study of some of the most basic, some of the most important experiences that we have, specifically the experiences of love and sex. And I mean, I've been reading these things for years, and I feel like I continue to learn from the stuff I read there. They're not easy sections. I mean, I think there are some central points he makes which are easy enough to get, and that's what I'm going to present here. But the actual details of his analysis are complex and rich, and so there's a lot of depth here, and there's a lot to study. But anyway, what I want to do is just talk through what I take to be the sort of core structure and sort of the core insights or the core points that he's making. And of course, you can then go on to work in more detail on the specific analyses he makes. But yeah, so we're going to this section of the book actually has three parts. It has the first part, which is basically about love, the second part, which is basically about sex, and then a third part, which is about the experience of the we. And that's what we're really, even though I'm going to talk about love and sex as this exciting stuff he talks about, what we really want to get onto is that discussion about the we, because that's going to be our bridge into the discussion of the critique of dialectical reason and the study of social and political life in general. So that's what we're going to get here: love, sex, and social life, political life. So the book so far, we've looked at the initial definition of being for itself in the introduction called The Pursuit of Being. We looked at the freedom and anxiety and so on in the section on the origin of negation, and then we've gone ahead to look at the look and the effect the experience of another person has on our experience, and the body as the sort of medium in which all that stuff is carried out. And so those issues have provided us with our sort of interpretive resources for now entering into studying and discussing not new structures, but more how we concretely live, right? So we've seen that those are the kinds of things that sort of make up what kind of being we are. So what's life actually like? That's more or less what we're talking about now, hence the title Concrete Relations with Others. So what was the main point about that section of the relations with others, the section on the look? The point there was that we can't fail to be affected by how others perceive us. It's not a matter of personal preference that another's perception on you matters to you. On the contrary, he's trying to show that's an ontological condition. That's not a psychological quirk of you. That's an ontological dimension of every human being. Every being that is a free being for itself in the way that he has studied that in this book. It's our very condition as the free beings that we are to find ourselves exposed to the free perspectives of others, and that situation of being exposed to the free perspective of another effectively takes out of our hands our ability unequivocally to define ourselves, even though simultaneously it's the case that the very fact that we're free kind of puts us in the position of having to define ourselves. So our very condition is that we're defined by a kind of tension and a kind of contradiction. A contradiction between the need to be self-defining and the reality of being other-defined. And one of the points that he has been really trying to stress is like you can't really disavow who you are for others. You can't remove from your existence that you find yourself to be someone that you can't not be, but also you can't ever really inhabit that who that others know you to be. It's just an attempt to sort of remind you of where we were with that issue of relations with others, as this sort of existential struggle we face in our very being, in our very question of who we are. We're in a fundamental way, we're kind of at odds with ourselves. We have two different senses of who we are, two different selves in a way that don't easily come together. That sets us ontologically in our very being in a condition of caring about how we are for others, or who we are to others, caring about how others recognize us, caring about the perspective others have upon us. It matters how others see us. On the one hand, it can hurt. On the other hand, it can be nice. And so the thing I want you to think about here is what we want out of the perspective of another is a kind of validation. Right? The other, in a way, holds a kind of key to who we are. And we can't control that. So what we'd like is for that key to kind of solve a problem and make us be okay. So what is desirable is that our experience of the perspective of another is that it validates us. It makes our existence work out and makes our existence worthwhile. So that's really what he's going to look at in this section on concrete relations with others. He's looking at basically how we, the ways in which we find validation of ourselves in and through our experiences with other people. So there are really two. He's trying to show here that there are two really basic ways that we experience a promise of resolving that tension between my perspective on myself and the other's perspective on me. There's a way that we take that conflict in principle between two things that can't just be one, that can't really be brought together, a promise of how they could be brought together. And those are basically love and sex. So the love and sex are two most basic ways of interacting with another person in ways that are sort of intimately important, that hold out the promise of being able to identify who I am for myself with who I am for you, basically. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But love and sex are very familiar words we use. We talk about them all the time, and we act like we know what they are. But what Sartre is going to offer us here is a very subtle and perceptive phenomenological description of the realities of love and sex, the phenomenological description of the experiences we have to which we attach that name. And we will see just how well we know what they are. Basically, what his descriptions show is that love and sex do not so much name real experiences in a simple sense. Rather, love and sex essentially name ideals. And what we have is a lot of practices we go through, a lot of experiences we go through that are the attempt to realize that ideal. But we will see in both cases that there's a fundamental and sort of unevadable way in which the practices we engage in to try to realize this ideal in principle can never exactly do it. So sex and love are both defined in our experiences by a real disparity between, you might say, their ideality and their reality, or what those basic things really mean versus what we actually do. And so, as I said, love and sex are the kinds of relationships we have that really hold out the promise for us of sort of solving this existential problem that defines us, right? They speak to a kind of ontological need we have. They're basically the things that are going to let us be who we are in the context of the reality of dealing with other people. And in that sense, they're the promise essentially of a kind of happiness. But as I also said, there's a constitutive disparity between the ideal in each case and the realities we pursue. So what that means is our practices, our experiences of love and sex, such as they are, on the one hand, do bring us real experiences of joy. They are sites of some of the most important satisfactions that we have in our life. They're of profound existential significance for our lives. But they're also the sites of unhappiness. They're also the sites of precisely the experience of not being able to get what you want, not being able to be what you want, and so on. Right? And this, again, just to repeat a point I made, that's our existential condition, right? These aren't just the contingencies of how some particular people happen to behave. These are the characteristic realities of human life, right? We're continuing to map out the condition of being human, and love and sex are definitive human, for lack of a better word, projects. So I want to go on and go through Sartre's descriptions of those things. Again, not in great detail, but I sort of want to outline them. I want to say two things before jumping into it to help you think about how you should be oriented to studying these. And so in each case, in the case of love and in the case of sex, it seems to me you need to sort of be clear on essentially the definition, the defining orientation he's talking about. And then the second thing is, as you go through his description, the thing to remember is that as a phenomenological description, right, it's a description of the form in which our experience unfolds. And you remember from way back on about page 41 when he was talking about Pierre and the cafe, the thing he drew attention to was the issue of figure and ground. And so in a way, what he's doing in going through these analyses is trying to be very precise about the character of the experiential figure in a loving situation or a sexual situation. So again, that's what you need to be focusing in any phenomenological description. You need to be focusing on the way that the distinctive character of the experiential figure is being articulated. So you need the definition, that you got to be attentive to figure and background. And I realize I want to say one more thing too, and that is that one of the most important things, again, for understanding his analysis here is that distinction between unreflective experience and reflective experience. And so what's crucial to both of these is the kind of unreflective character of the experiences of loving or of desiring. Right? Remember again from page 76, the consciousness of man in action is the unreflective consciousness of exigency, and so on. That's kind of the continuing point here. We're thinking of love and sex as things that you experiences you undergo more so than things that you reflectively do, and that will become clearer, I think, as we go through it. But let me try to say in a few words what the core, as I put it a minute ago, the core definition of each of these things is, so you understand what he's talking about. So the experience of the other, our relationship to the other, is the experience of the look. And the point that he tried to make in his analysis of our experience of the other is that you can essentially be looked at, or you can look at the other. And we talked about what's at stake in those two different situations, and sort of why you can't inhabit both roles at the same time. Well, that's essentially that distinction is the key to understanding this. Here, we're going to be looking at those ways that we find a fundamental satisfaction of our existential needs in the experience of, in relationship with another, and that means in the experience of the look. And the difference between love and sex is essentially the difference between looking and being looked at. So the experience of love is finding your subjectivity, finding who you are, essentially realized and validated through the look of the other. So, or put that in slightly different words, through your being looked at by that other. That's to be in love is to want to be who you are seen to be by that other, essentially. Sexual desire, on the contrary, is again, it's a fundamental relationship to the other. It's a fundamental way of being, of having who you are defined by your relationship with the other. But in this case, you're defined by the other who is themselves defined by you looking at them. So that's the crucial distinction, the other as looking or the other as looked at by you. The other is looking at you or the other is looked at by you. That's the key difference to the kind of role you're inhabiting with respect to the other, to find your validation in love and sex, respectively. So now let's go on and talk more specifically, first about love. So love is something suffered and realized, as he says on page 476. Right? It's not a project and a goal you have. You don't set out to love. Love is something that you find yourself experiencing, and that's a crucial thing to remember in all this. We're talking about experiences you undergo, ways you find yourself experiencing. So it's not something you can just turn on or off. But what we're doing is we're analyzing what's actually going on in those experiences. So to be in love, to love someone, is essentially you love someone else when you find their perspective is the thing that matters. You experience them as effectively defining what is important. Their look, their way of perceiving, is the one that moves you and matters to you. And more specifically, you could put it this way: to love that person is to want to be defined by, to experience yourself as defined by how they look at you. Right? You love that other person when you have this immediate sense you undergo that their recognition of who you are is the one that matters, right? So they're like the sunlight, right? You love someone when they are the thing that sort of makes the world worthwhile. They are the thing that is what everything is about, right? But so then, more importantly, what you want is, in that person, sunlight defining who you are, you want to find out that the way they experience you is that you're great, right? Basically, you want them to love you, right? When you love someone, you want it to be the case that that person, whose perspective is the one that matters, turns to you and finds you to be the one that matters. And so, in your own experience, you're, kind of the center of the world, right? And that's that's sort of the very meaning of subjectivity, the very meaning of perspective. Things are for you, right? And so, when you encounter in the encounter of another, you find that the world is oriented elsewhere, right? So, that fundamental thing, in a way, that is challenged by the experience of other people is our own sense of ourselves as being meaningful, as being important centers, as being at the center. And so what you want is that other person who you kind of recognize as the center or the important one, you want that person to say, you are meaningful. You are the center of the world. So you want that other person to have a perspective on you that roughly corresponds to the kind of a perspective you would have on yourself, right? And so when you're in love, you, as I said, find that other person to be the sunlight, to be the thing that makes the world makes the world meaningful. And what you want is for that person, in defining you, to have themselves finding you to be exactly that same thing. You want them to find you to be the sunlight. When you really want someone to love you, and when you are in love with someone else, right? That is, as I said before, something suffered. It's unreflective. It's not a project you undertake. It's something you find yourself experiencing. And, Sartre quotes, some of the familiar kinds of things people say, like, oh, it was meant to be, or you are my soulmate, or something like that, right? Those ways that people talk are not just nonsense, right? They really name that sense of wanting to be kind of picked up and validated at the very core of our being, right? So the one who is the real one picked you out as the real one. That's kind of the ideal of love, that you found your perfect mate, not just a convenient person to spend some time with, and it will be, life will be a little bit nicer if you have some friendly companionship. Yeah, that's a nice thing, but that's not what love is, right? Love is feeling like you are the one, and having that person feel like you are the one. But so that sense of really the absolute singularity of the other and the absolute singularity of yourself is definitive of what the whole experience of love is about. But it's probably not too hard to see how it's the reality doesn't quite measure up to that. It can't measure up to that. I mean, the fact is, as he said, if you hadn't been living in this town at this time, or if you hadn't happened to come to that meeting on that occasion or whatever, you and this other person might never have met, and this would never have happened. On the other hand, you might have met somebody else, right? Or another way to put that is whatever relationship you do have has as much contingency in it as your own being does, really. And we sort of fantasize about this idea that this was destiny and so on, but it wasn't destiny. It was the contingent coming together of a couple of people that didn't have to happen, and something else might very well have happened if that didn't. So the sort of dream of perfect coalescence is already belied by the arbitrariness of the human circumstances that led to this thing happening. So that's one problem right off the bat. But then there are further problems too, and that is that you really you need the other person's love for you to be a reflection of them and their perspective, right? It can't be just a kind of robotic thing or a chemical thing. It's got to be that it's in how that person sees you that things matter, because it's that person as a free subject that you love, and it's in that person's free subjectivity that they have to find you to be the one, right? But so you need them to be free, but you also can't have them just choosing you. You can't have them just looking around and saying, oh yeah, no, you got these features, you got those features, like I'll pick you, right? It's not that. They have to be being they have to be suffering the love the same way you are. They have to be swept up by what is for them the unavoidable weight of your and worthiness of your being. So you need the other person to freely freely choose you in a way, but it can't be a choice that they had any choice about. That's not in itself exactly a contradiction so much as it is a description of what form this experience has to take. But it's important because it sort of shows you what other kinds of things wouldn't really be right. And so the problem is, in a fundamental way, there is an element of choice in what that other person does. Like, it may, of course feelings of love are real, and surely that other person was swept up by you too. But as life rolls on, that person will live in relationship to you, not just in that hypnotized state, but as a particular person interacting, as a free choosing being in the world, seeing you as another thing in the room, another person in the room, a person with whom plans have to be made, and so on. And so your experience of the other has to be of a person who can, and in fact will, always kind of awaken from that dream and deal with you as just a person like other people, and the continuation of your experience will depend on that person choosing to continue. So the point I'm trying to get at there is that the very fact that it is the other person's freedom that has to make it be the case that you can be loved means, the fact that it's that person's freedom means that this is in a way never secure. And so again, that dream of the perfect singularity of the other person, the perfect singularity of you coming together by destiny, can't happen. That's not what's going on. And so your own attitude towards the other person too can be a little bit tricky, right? Because you want that other person to love you, you want it to be the case that that other person's look defines you, right? You want that other person's subjectivity to be the thing that defines you. But you can actually find that your desire to be loved leads you to try to make that other love you. So in a way, you try to seduce the other. You try to make yourself seem to the other to be a kind of fascinating object, to be mysterious and interesting. You try to do the things that make it look like you are part of this world of interesting things that's kind of mysterious to the other person. But there, you then are trying to have an effect on them, right? And you're sort of shifting from, well, first of all, you're shifting from being defined by them to being the one whose agency is having an effect on them. And you're having an effect on them by making them be essentially an object that you're doing something to. It's a kind of an instrumental relationship there as you try to manipulate that other person's perspective. So, there are just a couple of problems here, right? That the role you define for yourself that you think that other person is going to give you is never one you can so clearly and easily have. Like, on the one hand, you're kind of insecure because the very nature of the beloved's perspective on you is that it could go elsewhere. But also you too can try to manipulate the relationship by sort of slipping out of a simple unreflective absorption in this sort of stance of passivity to a kind of active attempt to manipulate and so on. I mean, these are a couple of examples of the things he says about where you see living out this thing to be at odds with the ideal. And he does a nice job of defining what the ideal is. This is on page 489. He says, thus love relations are a system of indefinite reference under the ideal standard of the value love. That is, and that value is a fusion of consciousnesses in which each would preserve his otherness in order to found the other. Right? So the thing that you're really after in love is that you really do come to identify with each other. You live out of a single shared experience, right? That notion of sharing is the ideal. And in a different sense, that's going to be true in sex as well. But sharing can't just be a melding. You need the other person to be a separate perspective, and you need yourself to be a separate perspective. And those two things, the sharing and the separateness, those are both present in the ideal, but they can't really be present in the reality. And the basic fact is the non-surpassable difference of your perspectives makes the ideal of love unrealizable. Doesn't mean you're never happy, right? But it means that thing that you really define as love, where the other person whom you love found your being by loving you, and you in turn found the other person's being. That can't really happen. Anyway, so he says, love is the contradictory effort to surmount the factual negation while preserving the internal negation. So, he wants you want it to be the case that, that person is really going to be a different perspective, but you don't really want it to be the case actually that we have two different perspectives. So you need the other person to be an independent subjectivity, but you also need the other person not really to be a separate subjectivity. And that's sort of the core of the problem. So that's my quick attempt to describe the core structure there, sort of what it is that love is about, and a little bit about the ideas about why, when we live through this, we find ourselves wrapped up in forms of experience that fall short of being that ideal. And we basically, you flip back and forth between doing this for a while, doing this for a while, doing this for a while. There is an ensemble of activities we engage in to live out the experience of love, but that multiplicity of different relationships, no one of which realizes love, also as an ensemble don't fully realize love, right? Love remains an ideal and a kind of contradictory ideal. It's a thing we're after, that no situation we're ever going to be in could live up to. Okay, so let me move on to talking about sexual desire now. This one is, again, as he says, a kind of original relationship of human reality, original way we deal with this issue of being in a world with another. But here, instead of defining yourself by the look of the other, which is what you do when you love someone, you want to be the person they see. Here, the relationship to the other is such that you want to relate to the other where they define themselves by being looked at by you. And so, in your desire, to feel, again, remember these are things suffered. He says that on page 500 here, right? This is a reality suffered. This isn't a project you have. This is in the sense of a reflective, deliberate activity. This is something you undergo. You find yourself sexually desiring someone else. But the question is, what does that mean, right? He's trying to describe that experience and sort out exactly what the things are that are alive there. And the idea here is, in sexual desire, what you want is for the other person to, through his or her or their freedom, to themselves want to accept the identity they have from your desiring gaze. So your desiring gaze at them is something you want them to desire. So here, remember I said these are situations of validation and basically situations of a kind of sharedness or whatever. In love, we saw how the loving the other turns into wanting to be loved. And that's sort of the goal, is this mutual loving. Well, similarly here, there's a reciprocity of desire that is the goal of sexual desire. You want your desire to be what the other desires. But again, you don't want it to be at the level of a deliberate, reflective choice. It's not a decision. You want the other person to suffer it. Suffer meaning undergo, not have a bad time. You want the other person to find themselves desiring your desiring gaze. And what is it that you're actually doing in that relationship, and what is the nature of the desire? Well, you're basically, he says, through your desire, you are oriented towards that another person, as a body, right, as a fact in the world. And your desire is then to relate to that person as being present in the body, or that body as the person being present. And in your seeing them as that body, to have them live the desire to be that body. So the sexual desire and the distinctive behavior that involves, which is what he calls the caress, is essentially the making of that person into a body, right? Or he calls it incarnating them. And the idea of making them into it, like that sounds like you're doing something to them, making them. In a certain sense, that's right. Because the point of this is that's what the other person wants. The other person wants to be made by you into a body. Obviously, it can't be a making in the sense of a material fabrication. It also can't be the making in the sense of a simple imposition, because we're dealing with a relationship between freedoms. But that's the issue. The issue is for the other to embrace and to allow you to make them into a body. Anyway, I think Sartre's description here is really unbelievably good, extremely insightful. It's quite long, but I don't think I've ever read anything about sexuality that I think is anywhere near as insightful as this. And if you read Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, which has some great stuff about sexuality, it's just basically lifted from this chapter. And that's great too. Merleau-Ponty goes on to do some other stuff too, but like this stuff Sartre says here is so potent. And I think there's a great deal to learn about it, and especially this stuff about incarnation and about the nature of the caress. And he's really good at describing the distinctive kind of passivity that characterizes distinctive sexual interaction, right? And this is the key to the thing too, right? That the thing that we're grappling with is the fact that we're just kind of that we're contingent facts in the world. You're just kind of a lump of stuff. It's a recognition you can have about yourself that just makes you feel sick. It's like, oh, I don't want to be this thing, And of course, some people have that relationship to themselves. They discover their bodies and they just want to get rid of it. Right? They want to die. They want to make it shrink away to nothing or whatever. Well, the thing about sexual desire is it's picking up on exactly that thing that you could hate about yourself, exactly that thing you could be embarrassed about in yourself at a kind of ontological level, right? The fact that you are a body. And sexual desire is taking that thing where you can feel most de trop, as he says, most inappropriately excessive, and it turns that into something kind of celebrated. It makes you that. That's what the other person desires, and you desire to be desired in that way. I think in his description, I think you can really see something about why. I mean, of course, you can see something about why this is such a sexual desire, such a profoundly moving thing, and such a profoundly existentially important thing. Like in other words, it's not a trivial thing like I'm hungry today, I want a snack. It's something that is meaningful to us in our very struggle to make sense of what we are as existing beings. And that description there that he makes there is about that character of incarnation and the caress. I think is very powerful, because the idea there is you are, through the other person's desire, when you accept it, you are letting yourself sort of become a body, and you're not losing consciousness. It's not that, but you're becoming this sort of fact. And the thing he stresses there is this notion of inertia, right? This notion of, it's basically kind of the opposite of instrumentality, right? When you relate to things instrumentally, you are a kind of a choosing, planning consciousness, and things are separate objects you deploy in certain ways. Sexual desire, it's the opposite. It's this sort of merging of your consciousness and your embodiment in a way that you kind of find yourself in this body. And anyway, so he really stresses what he calls the inertia or the passivity of that. And he says that's what you're doing in a caress, is you're touching the other person. Right? It's still a relationship between subjectivities, but you're touching them in such a way that they kind of come to life in and as this body. But, and here's where the goodness and the badness both are going to come in together. The thing about the caress is it can't be a deliberate intentional manipulation. If you go around just thinking, I'm going to move these parts of the body here and there, then that's just an instrumental relationship where you're dealing with one object in the world together with a whole bunch of other objects. But the thing that was really supposed to be happening in sexual desire was your absorption in this unique desirable reality that also allowed that person to become this unique desirable reality. So as he says, everything about sexual desire is about sort of shutting down the rest of the world, making it this kind of it has to fall into the background so that you're just isolatedly wrapped up in this fact of being a fact. And so all instrumental relationships to other things have to be lost. The very presence of other things has to be lost, except insofar as they're wrapped up in your engagement with the body. So there can still be on the bed you're on can be meaningful and so on, but not in that kind of instrumental way, part of the fact of this unique moment you're embracing in its contingent singularity. But as soon as you try deliberately to use your hand as the putative caresser, you use your hand to do something, you're not caressing anymore, you're manipulating. Right? And so it's not just the case that the caress is the making of the other into their inertia, the incarnating of the other. Your caress has to be your succumbing to that same kind of reality in yourself. And so your caressing behavior can't be deliberate actions. It can't be a massage. It can't be a manipulation. It has to be you kind of letting your body take over and do what it does. So sexual interaction is a powerfully passive thing in this sense of letting go of your agency and allowing your body and its way of knowing bodies to interact with this other body. That's almost exactly the language he uses. And so really the sexual thing is very much a kind of submission to something that takes you over. Now, we could have said the same. I probably did say the same thing about love. I should have said the same thing about love. It's a different particular thing, but it's a similar thing. It's a similar structure of giving yourself over to something. And the problem with sexuality is that it turns into a project. That the pleasure that you feel in incarnation becomes a goal, and you start either manipulating the body of the other for the sake of producing pleasure in it, or having the other your relationship to the other's body be something that is now for the sake of you getting a certain kind of pleasure. So he says that pleasure, let me read it, it was on 5:15, he says, the experience of pleasure motivates a kind of reflective attention to pleasure. But he says pleasure is the death and failure of desire. Right? That this is one of the things that's so sad, and if this account is true, ridiculous about the way sexuality is typically portrayed. It's portrayed as the instrumental pursuit of pleasure. And his point is that there couldn't be anything more opposite to sex than that. Sex is about passion. It's about giving yourself over to incarnation. It's about the loss of reflection, the loss of intentional pursuit, and so on. But the intentional pursuit of pleasure, you could do that if you want. but there's no sexual desire in that. That's just a utilitarian entertainment, right? So, the thing that you're really after in sexuality, the sense in which it is a unique and distinctive and definitive kind of human conduct, is that it's a way of grappling with the problem that comes from the experience of the other. And it's dealing with that by trying to establish a certain kind of reciprocity. And that's not the thing that's happening in that kind of mutual manipulation. And that's the difficulty of sex, is that it's hard to maintain. It's hard to maintain that passion without it turning into this kind of instrumental project. Something similar was the case with love, right? There, as he says, there are these moments of joy. There's a way that you can live, in a sense, in either love or sex. You sort of live with a sense that we're doing this together, right? You can have that experience that you're part of a shared thing, and if you're lucky, the other person has that experience at the same time. But that experience doesn't sort of take over and run your whole life. It doesn't last, and that's part of the problem with these as ways of relating to another. Like there isn't a single thing that happens. They go through a series of different stages that, again, no one of which realizes the ideal. And again, here he defines the ideal in a way. It's because the precise strategy the strategy is not the right word, because the precise structure here is a little bit different. The terms of the ideal are a little bit different, but they're very similar in kind to the ideal he just gave of love. So on 512, he refers to the impossible ideal of desire as to possess the other's transcendence as pure transcendence, and at the same time as body. So basically, he's trying to, in the case of love, you want two people who are going to be fused, but they were still going to stay separate. And that's kind of the contradiction. Here, you kind of want us both just to become facticity, but to remain transcendences. And it's a similar attempt to have two things that are both essential and both real, and just try to, in a way, to try to say, I'm only going to have that one, but the other one too. So something like that, anyway, is the way he defines the ideal, and you can have that in mind as you look at these different sorts of things he says about the kinds of things we do and how they work and how they don't work. But as I said, all I wanted to do was to bring out the core idea. My point when I was talking about him saying that pleasure is the death of desire is that it's, as he says on 5:16, a kind of rupture of contact, right? That what you were trying to get was a certain kind of sharing, and something different is happening. It might still be nice. There might still be reasons you want to do this with another person, but the thing that you're doing when you're manipulating another person's body for pleasure is not quite the same as a passionate embrace. It's not quite the same as a passionate caress. And so here, with sexual desire, as with love, he's trying to document, through a careful phenomenological description of how our experience actually unfolds, he's trying to document the way something that starts out trying to be this turns into some other thing, right? And really to show thereby that it can't fulfill that ideal. And that's relevant because that ideal was, in a way, the motivation, or part of our motivation, in that we are trying to sort of solve our existential condition, and you're never going to solve your existential condition. So none of these things are actually going to work to change what it is to be that, as he said before, that kind of unjustifiable existence. But I want to read one more sentence about that. This is 527. Here he's just talking about the idea that, like, he's said a number of times, like, these are not just sort of psychological states, by which he means they're not just an attitude a person might or might not have. Right? He's saying these are fundamental ways of relating to the other that are intrinsically defined for all of us by virtue of the fact that we're human beings, right? And so he says that on 527, about, a dozen lines down or so. He says, as soon as there is the body, And as soon as there is an other, we react by desire, by love, and by the other derived attitudes that we've mentioned, because he talks about others. So I just want to read you that line just to remember that these are effectively universal human structures. These are meaningful structures, meaningful ideals that animate all human behavior. One other thing just about the things he says, and I'm not going to go further into it, but he also specifically talks about sadism and masochism as two other kind of ways of relating to another that we can also adopt for much the same reason. And they're sort of like the vices of love and sex. They're the things that these same projects can descend into. But masochism, basically, so it's almost like martyrdom, like you make yourself into nothing for the other. And sadism is kind of an attempt to bypass the other's freedom in a way, even as you're trying to win the other's freedom by making them feel you or something like that. I'm not going to analyze those two. His analyses are very good. They're actually not that long, whereas the analyses of love and sex are quite long, but they're quite good. And that idea that the structures of love and sex can sort of predictably turn into these other two, sadism and masochism, I think is also quite insightful. But anyway, I just wanted to talk through that stuff a bit to give you, as I said before, a kind of core sense of the point he's making about those two things. I hope I've done that. I hope I've made it clear enough that you can see how these things are addressing an existential issue and why it makes sense that those are the two attitudes you could have. I hope I've done a decent enough job to make you see that these descriptions he's giving do make sense of our experience. I hope I've also been able to, give some sense to the kind of problem he's talking about here in a way that is experientially meaningful and that will also allow you to read the text in more detail yourself. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and we'll come back next time and talk about the section on the we subject and the us object, in the last section, the third section of this chapter on concrete relations. And as I said before, that will then take us into our study of social relations and political relations and set us up for looking then at the critique of dialectical reason.